Good afternoon, everyone. The title has already been announced, and I will not, for the sake of time, read introductions which you have in your manual. However, I will say that this is a challenging lot. Every class has one or some. And you will notice that there's an educator, a social activist, a pastor, a politician. And so we have given a mini training to the timekeepers that they need to be particularly assertive with this group. So our panel consists of the Reverend Dr. Nicholas Genevieve Tweeve, Dr. Christy Warren, Dr. Adele Tankard, the Honorable Derek Burgess, and Ms. Linda Bogle. We will, after the presentations by the senior members of the panel, also have a discussion with two youth representatives from the Youth Parliament, Robert Thomas and Mackenzie Cole Tuckett. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Christy Warren.
Good afternoon. I'm going to set my stopwatch. We'll see how that goes. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is something that other people have touched on in their papers because it's inevitable. It's called Narratives of Resistance. In his book, Silencing the Past, Haitian historian Michel Roth-Trio looks at the links between history and power. In it, he explores, and I quote, many ways in which the production of historical narratives involves the uneven contribution of competing groups and individuals who have unequal access to the means of such production. And of that production, I'd say that includes money, time, familiar and societal support, to name but a few. He goes on to say that although the forces that he explores in his book are less visible than gunfire, class poverty, or political crusades, they are no less powerful. As has been noted already by previous speakers, and also by Trio, history writing in and of itself is a way that power is exerted in society. And if this is the case, then writing histories which attempt to rebalance the uneven historical narratives of the past is also a form of resistance. The emphasis that I place in this short presentation is on writing, but of course this is steeped in a wider colonial discourse, which encompasses many other institutions, such as government and things that we don't really think much about, like the archives, libraries, and museums. Pre-1970s historiography in Bermuda leans all the way back to the 17th century. The earliest writings by Europeans were for a European audience elsewhere. These early histories and literary texts, including Shakespeare, of course, and his Tempest, informed how local historians came to understand the island's past when they began to write, and that was mainly in the 20th century, early 20th century. A narrative of resolute English settlers and their descendants, which fit neatly within broader narratives of colonization, form the core of locally generated discourse. Unsurprisingly, a colonial settler narrative was also found in local textbooks and museum exhibitions. For instance, in 1937, 4,000 copies of The Early History of Bermuda for Children by Canon Tucker were printed for the use in junior departments of government-aided schools. It was, to my knowledge, the first textbook used in schools which concerned local history. If anyone knows of an earlier one, I'd like to know. This book focused, unsurprisingly, on discovery and settlement, and it remained the main text used for Bermuda history in primary schools for at least 20 years. The partiality of museum curators and the silences they created were noted by American observer Leonard C. Rennie. In a 1965 lecture to the Bermuda Historical Society, he stated that the views of history given in Bermudian museums were unbalanced. He argued for a history that explored the everyday lived experience. So part of resistance is not just thinking about what we were when things were bad. It's how did we survive every single day. He argued for a history that explored the silences that had been left in the heritage sector in Bermuda at the time, the absence of Black Bermudians, and the story of how they were instrumental to the development of this island. He asserted, and I quote, "You had slavery. Yet the only way visitors would know that you ever had slavery in these islands would be if you heard of Emancipation Day. The silencing has already been noted. It was excused away the worst of slavery and segregation, and this was a crucial part of forming a narrative about Bermuda's past. It was a narrative that positioned the descendants of settlers as benevolent patriarchs and was used to downplay the role of persistent racial hierarchies to maintain the status quo in society. I'm running at 4 minutes, so yours is a bit fast. Was used by to maintain the status quo in a society that featured a majority black population. In this way, black Bermudians remained economically, politically, and socially disenfranchised. So Dr. Swan spoke about the kind of political changes that happened in the 50s, so I will skip that part. But there was frustration at the slow pace of political change. There was also resistance to change of the status quo, and it came not just from elites, but also from others who profited from the systems in lesser ways, and also from those who actually didn't profit from it at all, but feared change that they felt needed to be avoided in case it brought about something worse. In the 1960s and 70s, old colonial tropes were reframed and redeployed. The need for change was acknowledged, but it was noted that this needed to be incremental to protect the island's stability. That was said to be needed for both the tourist industry and the nascent international business industry. The local media, of course, played its role in this tug and pull between competing narratives, with the Royal Gazette and the Bermuda Recorder playing key parts. In the 1970s is when we see a change in narrative. And we've spoken about some of these. Some of the change in narrative comes before, of course, with Eva Hudson's first-class citizens, second-class men. Why the 1970s? Well, there's the historical context that has already been spoken about, but there's also something else that happens. That's when the local archives came under the purview of the government for the first time. Historically, no concerted effort was made to either by the local legislator in Bermuda or the bureaucrats in London to create an archive to conserve locally held documents concerning the colony's history. I'm sure most of us have heard of Lefroy. So Lefroy was interested, he was governor, but he did not do that conservation under his official role. London did not help him. He did that off his own back. And of course, we know his transcriptions were problematic, but he saved that archive from both the disinterest of the local legislator and the officials in London. Access to original source material concerning the island was partially rectified when the Bermuda Historical Monuments Trust established a small private archive that had held the colonial records at their center, but also included non-governmental documents. The restructuring of government in 1968 led to the disbandment of that organization. Its successor, the Bermuda National Trust, was established in 1970. Keyly, responsibility for the maintenance of that archival collection passed to the newly formed government archive. The archive brought together official papers still held by various government offices, together with those documents that have been preserved by Lefroy and the colonial records that have been collected by the BHMT. It also included personal documents of businesses, individuals, and families. In 1974, the Bermuda Archives Act was passed, creating a policy for the Bermuda Archives of Bermuda for the first time. Let that sink in, 1974. This interest in government records and historical documents came after the creation of party politics and the increased participation of formerly disenfranchised Bermudians cannot be seen as a coincidence. It was in this decade that Bermudian historian Cyril Packwood wrote the first comprehensive slave history of Bermuda, Chained on the Rock. The preface, written by Kenneth Robinson, emphasized the important gap in knowledge that Packwood's text filled, as information about this part of Bermuda's past was almost non-existent when the book was written. In this preface, Robinson identified the vital link between access to knowledge and knowledge production. He revealed that some of the local sources Packwood researched for his work had only recently become accessible to Black people, and he took full advantage of them whenever he visited his native land. That's Robinson's words. Other writers also noted the role of the local archive in helping them to develop their work. In the introduction to Nellie Musson's Mind the Onion Seed, Bermuda's government archivist, Leonard J. MacDonald, notes that Musson's archival research covered material that was not usually used. It was there, but it had been ignored. Importantly in these texts, they were not just dependent on the archive. They drew on a long history of oral telling within the Black community. Importantly, Packwood's work could also be traced back to his own father's interests in the past. The strength of this oral tradition was also explored in the book. In fact, Packwood, according to his daughter Cheryl, was, I quote, an orator at heart. Thus, this new information of history drew on both archival research, as well as the oral history tradition. And that's what I've got left. These writers wanted to ensure that Black Bermudians understood their histories and thus were better placed themselves in the present, confident in claiming their place within society that their ancestors had a core role in developing. Musson noted in Mind the Onion Seed that the book was the outcome of her own personal search for her family roots and the roots of other Black Bermudians. And in the foreword to Kenneth Robinson's Heritage, Dr. Norma Cox Aswood noted the text provided new insights into the previously stereotyped versions of what slavery and other aspects of life were like then. It is my expectation that most readers will have many of their own judgments and prejudices challenged when they read this work. We must continue to write and read histories that shift us from the complacency that they challenged. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Warren, for the knowledge and for being a wonderful model to your colleagues. I now invite Dr. Adele Tankard, who will speak on the pursuit of equality and justice for the Muslim community in Bermuda.
Good afternoon, and again, I greet you in peace, and to my Muslim brothers and sisters, I say Assalamu alaikum. It's certainly an honor and pleasure to be here to be a part of the discourse and actually to pay tribute and recognize the work of Dr. Hudson and Ms. Harvey and the Progressive Group and all of those who've made the sacrifice. One can only imagine the efforts and the struggles that were necessary to bring us thus far. And so I speak this afternoon from the Islamic perspective, not just from the position of resistance, but more so from a position of persistence. From the standpoint that the latter speaks more to continuously moving forward with your objective in mind. So let's proceed forward. I'll share a bit about the birth of the Nation of Islam and its mission, the Islamic faith and its fortitude, and it combating racism. Perhaps two examples of Clara Muhammad School and Muhammad Speaks, and then where we are today with respect to the Islamic community. It is without doubt, without question, that racism is the foundation in Bermuda society. In the creation of race construction, it occurred in two phases. From the beginning of time, or the early settlers, up to 1970, and then the 1970s and 80s, and perhaps we can argue today that the third phase has just occurred when you talk about international business and the lack of diversity in males, et cetera, in that particular institution or that industry. But even before we get there, let's just make the point that racism, as our dearly beloved scholar, Dr. Swan points out, was actually built into colonialism. And in the case of colonialism, I think it's important for us, get these notes sorted out, to remember that Bermuda is still a colony. And as much as we enjoyed these privileges, there's more work to be done with this respect. Why? Because colonialism is a system whereby the colonizers rule through policies used for the purpose of controlling foreign independence. It's also a system which perpetuates policies of exploitation, where the colonizers have the monopoly over the economy. Moving forward, colonialism also brings forward the idea of inferiority in the society. And so it is against this backdrop that the Nation of Islam, via the Muhammad Speaks newspaper, arrives in Bermuda. I must point out as well that this time, this 1960s and 70s era, is a time when other organizations, such as the Bermuda Industrial Union, which is already established, the Progressive Labor Party, and of course, as we heard earlier, from the Black Beret Cadre, were formed, very active in the society. The organization itself, the Nation of Islam, as we well know, was created by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who was influenced by Marcus Garvey. And so Garvey's philosophy was self-determination, to do for self. Elijah Muhammad believed that it was important for African Americans who were being oppressed to create a system that would combat the racial oppression and injustice in the society. So that transformed and arrives here in Bermuda in the 1960s. In so doing, gentlemen such as Kenneth Castle, Dilton Matthews, Askia Muhammad pick up the paper and have the desire to disseminate it nationally. We know that much risk was involved in this dissemination because the paper was banned in 1963. And it was banned under this premise, which was put forward by Lord Modmer, that the doctrine of black supremacy and non-corporation of whites could affect the less colored Bermudians. Okay, the doctrine of black supremacy and non-cooperation of the white community could affect the less colored Bermudians. That's where we are. That's where it was. Already? In so doing, the members of the Nation of Islam saw fit to persist, selling a total of 12,000 papers. In any event, 1974 marks the highlight, the peak of the Nation of Islam, in that the organization is able to formulate its beliefs, its value system, establish businesses, increase its membership. I believe they were in excess of over 300 members, and they become a mainstay in the community, so to speak. But 1975 is very significant because it brings about the passing of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And in so doing, his son, Imam Warati Muhammad, assumes the leadership of the Nation of Islam. Imam Muhammad, bless his soul, created one man, brought about a transformation of black Muslims and converted over 1 million African Americans, and by extension Bermudians, into Orthodox Islam. Dr. Suleiman Yang identifies it as a bloodless revolution, where 1 million African Americans saw fit to make the transformation from the Nation of Islam to Orthodox Islam. Okay, and I point out there, the idea of Orthodox Islam being that there's one God, prayer, fasting, charity, and a visit to Mecca. Now, in that transformation, he also changes the name of the Muhammad Speaks newspaper to Balalian News. So the fact that even though the paper was banned, it never became an issue no longer because the name was changed. Moving forward, perhaps the largest obstacle, the biggest obstacle was with respect to the Muslims opening an elementary school. And what I've pointed out here is the timeline and the articles that were back and forth throughout the country in this effort, a total of 15 years for this religious community to open up a school. And, let me make the point, and by 1990, when the time had come, there was still no government approval. So, were they resistant or were they persistent? In addition to the opening of the school, Imam Muhammad also had recommended that the Muslim community become engaged in the broader community, that it open its doors to other ethnicities and other communities, because the philosophy prior to that was one of, quote unquote, separation. The Nation of Islam did not want to integrate with the main society. Perhaps one of the most significant points that he stressed to the community was the idea of impressing upon them and the believers the removal of racial images in religious institutions and in the homes because of the negative impact it had on individuals. You know, you're familiar with the Kenneth Clough study with respect to the dolls, where little children were given a black doll and a white doll. Well, interestingly enough, that effect still takes place today. Why? In 2018, we still see African-American women bleaching themselves, bleaching their skin, wanting to be of a lighter complexion. So, let's push this forward. I have a minute, they say. What's happening in the transformation, since the transformation? Well, since 2016, 2014, the local community has seen fit to host a number of international conferences where 150 to 200 Muslims have seen fit to visit the shores and integrate with Bermudians. We've seen the submission of the Masjid Muhammad submissions to the Independence Commission. Now, this is very significant. Why? Because I told you earlier about the purpose of colonialism and what it is in the Muslims' position with this. Then and now, it's important for us to determine our destiny as a people. In 2012, there was the appointment of the first Muslim senator, Brother Cromwell Shakir, and then recently in 2018, they have the highest ranking female officer, Muslim Naima Aswad. What else is happening? Well, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, Muslims take the time to feed the homeless. They reach out, interfaith dialogue, visit the prisons, etc. There's much to be done. There's a hospital that needs to be built. A cultural center that needs to be established. And so the challenge for the next generation or the present generation is to embrace modernity with patience and perseverance, but more importantly, believe and know that their responsibility is to follow through from the work that has been done from our pioneers. I leave you with Frantz Fanon's quote, "Every generation out of relative obscurity must explore its mission or purpose. Fulfill it, you got it."
Thank you very much, Dr. Tankard. I would like to invite the Honorable Darius J.P. MP to speak to us on the Bermuda Industrial Union.
Good afternoon. First, timekeepers don't start yet. I would like to just recognize a wonderful lady from the Bible Belt of Hamilton Parish, Dr. Hudson. You know, it's my belief that if this country would have paid attention to Dr. Hudson over 35 years ago, our problems that we have today would have been probably gone. So Dr. Hudson, thank you for what you've done for us. I stand on your shoulders. Thank you. The book, The History of the Bermuda Industrial Union, documents the efforts of the men and women who brought the BIU through its most difficult times. They were workers who had the courage of their convictions, as well as the commitment to confront the hypercritical, vindictive, and deeply entrenched oligarch that was hell-bent on systematically controlling all facets of Bermuda's 20th century economic, social, and political affairs. They were aided and abetted by a succession of colonial governors prepared to go to any lengths in sustaining themselves in power. In Bermuda, the working conditions were so oppressive that during the first 115 years after emancipation, workers were only able to mount 3 major demonstrations against the exploitation of their labor in 1853, 1902, and 1945. The 1853 protest was against the government's plan to use taxpayers' money to import white Portuguese laborers to undercut wage rates demanded by black workers. Black workers condemned that proposal by a legislature composed totally of white employers. In 1902, the demonstrations centered on the mistreatment of several hundred Jamaican men, women, and children who had been recruited under contract to work at the Royal Naval Dockyard in Iron Island. Upon arrival in Bermuda, they were dismayed at what they termed gross violations of their contracts. Full employment and wages that they had been promised were not paid. Neither were their accommodations adequate. American-born pastor from the AME Church, Reverend Charles Vinton Mung, took up the plight of the workers soon after he arrived in Bermuda, and he vowed that he was prepared to fight to the end to eradicate the injustices of these workers. Reverend Monk also owned and published the newspaper called The New Era, and he wrote articles in his newspaper about the harsh treatment of the workers, and he exposed the corruption in public places. Protests by workers were met with abuse from their bosses. The more vocal of the individuals demanding their rights were summoned before the Somerset magistrate and often jailed on the slightest pretext. There was a series of riots at the dockyard. Fires were set to buildings. The next day, the first reading was given in Parliament of the 1902 Riot Act. Several of the workers were arrested. 8 were jailed to a term of up to 8 months. In the aftermath of the rioting, because of Reverend Monk's coverage of the events in his newspaper, he was charged with criminal libel and tried in the Supreme Court. He was found guilty, sentenced to 6 months in jail and fined £300. Reverend Monk defiantly declared that he did not expect justice, having to appear in court before a Chief Justice whose son was the prosecuting Attorney General. The Assistant Justice on the bench was the latter's father-in-law. Reverend Monk called them the Father, the Son, and the Unholy Ghost. I guess I would call him the lynch mob. Today, we have Reverend Tweed, also from the AME Church. Reverend Tweed was also one of the founders of the People's Campaign, who called for equality, jobs, and justice in Bermuda. Because of his active participation with the People's Campaign, the former OBA government refused to renew his work permit in an effort to silence him. The church appealed the ruling by the minister, which was what was unfair about the adjudication of the appeal is that the same minister who refused the work permit also turned down the appeal. The Bermuda Conference of the AME Churches took the case to court. The Chief Justice ruled that the Bermuda government's denial of a work permit and the attempt to deport Reverend Tweed was unlawful in what would be recorded as a historical landmark victory for the AME Church and the people of Bermuda. So you see, nothing has really changed from Reverend Monk's time in 1898 to Reverend Tweed's time in 2017. And let me say that during the time that Reverend Tweed was waiting the court date, the church made a request to the government that Reverend Tweed be allowed to officiate and eulogize one of his members. The government told him no. Keep me out of your pulpit. Unionism came late in Bermuda. In fact, the first blue-collar labor organization was started in 1944 when the Bermuda government forced the newly established U.S. bases to cut wages of Bermudians working on base. They did not want their rates of pay to exceed the wages paid by the Bermuda employers. Because of this injustice, workers got together and formed the NOB Workers Association. They realized that labor could not expect to get a fair wage unless and until it formed a permanent organization. Later, the name changed to Bermuda Workers Association and subsequently the Bermuda Industrial Union. The 1965 Belco riots on February the 2nd, 1965, is a red letter day in the archives of the BIU. Ira Phillip wrote, "It marked the climax as one of the union's most celebrated disputes when police and workers clashed in what is known as the Belco riots. This was a recognition dispute between the BIU and Belco. The union's application for recognition to Belco was refused. There was intervention from the Labor Relations Office, and the company agreed to a ballot provided that all 231 employees participate in a vote, which included supervisors and management personnel. And they also stipulated that the union must get 60% of the yes vote in its favor. Obviously, the union could not accept that. Strike action started on Tuesday, January the 1965. 80 of the 97 employees went on strike. As a result of the February 2nd riots, several of our members were charged in courts. 4 of them, namely Kenny Paul, Vivian Ming, Josh De Silva, and Kervin Reddery, were sentenced to 12 months in prison. After 4 months, Kenny Paul, who will be eulogized tomorrow, was acquitted upon appeal. Ming, De Silva, and Reddery served 6 months of their 12-month term. They were granted amnesty stemmed from persisting lobbying by the BIU and Reverend Coles from Richard Allen AME Church. Let me close by talking a little about the income disparity that exists today that has been cast in stone. And if it were not for the unions, it would be worse, because unions base their negotiations on the job or position rather than on gender or race. If you look at the 2016 census report, you will see that every job category is outlined with blacks and whites. With the same positions, whites are paid more than blacks. This standard officially started in 1834, when whites refused to pay black workers the same rates that their masters hired them out for. You know, it was one politician that came to me last year, and they were sort of annoyed. They said, I'm peeved off. They used another word. But they said they just finished a job. This person's very well competent, CPA. And what they found out, the person that replaced them not only got more money, that didn't bother too much, but that person got $8,000 a month in live-out expenses, something they never got. That continues today. As I stated earlier in my presentation, that the oligarchy were hell-bent on controlling all facets of Bermuda. In my opinion, it still continues in regard to income. In the 2017 final report of the Commission of Inquiry, the members of the panel, John, Fiona, and Anthony, wrote something that even today indicates that they still want to control what one segment of the population earns when they made the following statement. And they made this statement based on an assumption. They said the level of compensation for providing collateral for Winters Burgess and Vincent Hollandsey, they don't mind me using the name because it's out in the public, appears on the face of it to be excessive. What they are actually saying is that there should be a cap on what black people earn, and the sky's the limit for whites. What is amazing that a fellow named Mr. Berlin was employed at the dockyard for the American's Cup and made hundreds of thousands of dollars in an 18-month period, and he ends up getting an award from my aunt, Queen Elizabeth. Thank you.
I have no comment. I would like to invite Ms. Linda Bogle Meinzer, social activism and Facebook warrior.
Good afternoon. I think I deserve more of a clap than that because that's better. That is better. One, because I don't know how I got on this radical panel. And two, because I get to go before Reverend Tweed. That would have been a difficult act to follow. And so, I will proceed. Let my 10 minutes not start yet. I want to take you on a journey of life, of resistance. Could you please stand for me real quickly? Real quickly. Don't be resistant. And I know you just finished lunch, but could you hold your breath for me? As long as you can. And resist the urge to breathe. Anybody struggling yet? If you're struggling, sit down. Oh, there are some fighters left. True warriors. Oh yes, my uncles laugh. We come from good family. Good, strong structure. That's Kita's father too. So what did that feel like? Having difficulty resisting the urge to breathe. That is what it's like for me in this country. That is what it's like for me as I live a life of resistance, as I resist being choked out of my life in various sectors of this community. I often say that I carry several bullseyes over my body. I'm going to share some with you today. I'm resisting today. When I was growing up and I started to become active in my various genres, most insisted that I wear a dress whenever I appeared before the public. When I was less radical, many years ago, I would acquiesce and wear a dress. Obviously, I changed. And I said, the first place I'm going to resist being choked out, and the first place I'm going to breathe, and the first place I'm going to resist is in my own house, in my own body, and in my own attire. And so now I wear the clothes of a resister. I think I look good in a bow tie. And we're not even going to talk about these sharp shoes I have on. And we're not even going to talk about this jacket that my wife picked out. See, the claps were less when I said that. Because that's another area in which I wear a bullseye. I resist the notion that I cannot be true to my reality. I resist the notion that I cannot marry in my country. Resistance today looks like standing up time and time again against an injustice when you are an equal taxpayer and should have access to the equal services of the government in this country. And I will resist, and I will resist until we as a country get it right. And it may be long, but Dr. Hudson is an example that persistency will pay off. Love will always win. As a black woman in this country, I resist. I resist against the notion that we're not good enough to travel in the same circles as others. I resist the idea that we have to straighten our hair, though it's your choice. But we have arrived at a time where we can wear our hair as we wish. The afro is powerful these days. I tried it. It didn't go well for me. And so I was determined to resist the idea that I had to have hear it all. And I wear my bald head with pride and the knowledge that I will resist the idea of anyone who says to me, why don't you grow hair as women should do? I resist the idea that as a black unionist, I must be silent when I see injustice for the workers of this country. And I resist the idea that if I must get pepper sprayed, that I must be sprayed and go away and be silent. It will not happen. And if we have to resist in the streets, around the parliament, and wherever, again, for the workers of this country, I will be, as I always am, on the front row resisting. And the reason why we resist is not only for the injustices that we are still suffering today, but to make a pathway and build a bridge for our children who are coming behind us. Who I realized after last night, having a lovely conversation with some young people, that I must get to be building that bridge at every turn, because they're coming. And they are less silent, thank the Lord, than we are. And so as I go about my life, see, this is why I talked to these young people last night, because I know my time must be near, but I haven't got one flashcard, but I'm not even going to notice it. I haven't seen a card. These are the two I talked to. See, they didn't even give the rest this much time. I'm only on 6 minutes? Well done, well done. 4 more minutes to go. So let me tell you how my life goes on a daily basis. On a daily basis, I have to walk around this country and decide on which nostril I'm going to breathe out of so that I can operate in a safe environment. And sometimes I must hold my breath for a little while as a black woman and say all is good for us in this country, when we know it isn't true. We know it is difficult being a single black mother in this country and have the same expectation for our children than anybody else has. Because some people say you should not have had that many children. Or you should have got married before you had your children. Or you should have, and you should have, and you should have. And I say to all the single black mothers out there, resist. Resist and live your truth for your children. And resist the urge to be interrupted. Resist the urge to not be proud of your truth. It's been a long struggle. And it was a struggle because sometimes the resistance comes from within your own family, within your own race, within your own environments and your friends who say, if only you can turn it down a bit. And I'm here to say that resistance in 2018 looks like breathing freely and say, I will not compromise, I will not acquiesce, and I will not go back in the closet for you or anyone else, and I will resist, and I will resist, and I will resist until resistance becomes a thing of the past.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Bogle Meinzer. Our final panelist, the Reverend Dr. Nicholas Genevieve Tweed, is lost for a reason. We live in hope that he will mind the timekeepers.
As Jesse used to say, keep hope alive. Race, resistance, and fiction. The social construction of race is one of the threads which has been used to legitimize systems of white supremacy and invoked to provide justification for the protracted dehumanization of African and African-descended people. This is well documented in both historical fact and the enduring lived experience of African and African-descended people throughout the diaspora. Bermuda, like its British colonial counterparts, in this respect is no different. It is built upon a system that was constructed to establish and preserve white power and privilege, and has served and continues to serve its masters well. In fact, race is an inextricable thread that runs through the fabric of the social, cultural, and political system in Bermuda. It is so embedded that it has long been established as normative, just the way things are. And for the most part, black and white Bermudians both play their respective parts in its maintenance. The status quo, however, is and has not been without dissenters, resistors. That is to say that the untold story of Bermuda is the story of segments of the black community that stand in an unbroken chain of resistance to this system of white supremacy. As early as 1656, with men such as Black Tom, Cabellito, and Black Harry, to women such as Affie and Sarah Sally Bassett, the poisoners in the late 1720s. The October Revolution in 1761, that is said to have involved over half of Bermuda's black population at the time. Now, I draw upon these early references only to illustrate that these issues we discuss today are not new, and in addition to point to the fact that systems of power have a resilience of their own, and they too engage in resistance in response to those who would dare to challenge, confront, or threaten their security. Now, I would like to introduce 3 definitions and then offer a series of examples to illustrate in practice the challenges posed by responses to resistance. First, I take the term race to be a fictional socio-cultural construct in a larger system of white supremacy. I will come back to what I mean by the term fictional momentarily. I'm not suggesting that race is not real and that it does not, has not, nor continues to function with destructive and dehumanizing effects. What I'm saying is that it must be understood as a construct, something that was created by people for the purpose of legitimizing the superiority of whiteness as a system of power. Second, I take the term resistance to refer to the conscious decision to reject, to refuse, to accept, or comply with, to stand against what is deemed to be unjust. And here I use the phrase stand against what is deemed to be unjust rather than stand against a system of white supremacy, because much of the resistance that we have seen in Bermuda was not against a system of power, but rather against particular acts deemed to be unjust within a system of power, or persons deemed to be representative of it, a la the oligarchy or the 40 Thieves or a particular government of the day. One of the limitations of resistance and struggle up to this point in Bermuda has been the continued failure to extend analysis to a critical examination of the prevailing system of power in order to elevate the consciousness of the people to understand that standing against the symptoms of a system does not result in actions that are targeted at dismantling or transforming the system. Hence the seeming cyclical nature of resistance and struggle in Bermuda. So now let me return to the third term, fiction. I use the term fiction in its originary sense, from fingere, to form, to shape, to contrive. In this context, then, it refers to the forming or contriving of beliefs and or statements, histories, if you will, that are false, but are held to be true because it is expedient in that it serves the purpose of buttressing or propping up a system of power. The fiction of narratives surrounding race and resistance, in this sense, can be used so that even in standing against or resisting particular practices or acts committed, against those in service to this system of white supremacy, people can often, in actuality, be co-opted into courses of action that perpetuate and preserve the power, privilege, and injustice of the system. This has often led to the creation of vehicles or processes that only serve to change the location of oppressed people in Bermuda within the system of white supremacy. This locational change is achieved in part by exploiting the crass or extreme individualism and self-interest of persons who can be easily appeased by Pyrrhic victories of individual advancement that in reality do absolutely nothing to dismantle or overcome the system of power itself. You're not adding time when they clap. So resistance refers to acts of standing against particular manifestations of systemic power. In the process of resistance, a critical step is to break the silence by finding one's voice or giving voice to that against which or for which a stand is made. This has and continues to be a challenge in Bermuda because there is a well-established cultural predilection wherein it is deemed to be impolite or unseemly to openly speak about issues, especially issues of race and white power that are viewed as confrontational or challenging to the status quo. This, combined with fear, not completely unfounded, of being targeted for recrimination if one dares to challenge the established system of power. This is compounded by the fact that Bermuda has a history of silencing dissent, those whom it deems to be troublemakers, threats to the status quo. There are numerous historical examples of people being driven from the island, and among the most familiar are the Reverends Richard Hilton Tobbitt, Arthur Goldring, Charles Vinton Monk, Kingsley Tweed, who was exiled in the face of death threats, and members of the Black Beret cadre, to mention but a few. Each of these examples represents persons or groups that have been prepared to endure the risks that come with breaking the silence in an effort to advance the cause of justice and promote a common good that may have only been seen by them, yet spoke to the aspirational hopes of many of the silenced in the larger Bermudian community. In the face of resistance, governments in Bermuda have reverted to the use of persecution tactics, rendering individuals non-employable, calling in of mortgages with the bank, tactics that have been psychologically embedded and function as a deterrent to would-be resistors from engaging in revolutionary action. In this recent period, the former OBA government represents the most flagrant and egregious example of this practice of silencing resistance. In an effort to silence resistance to its privatization of the airport, it employed the use of slaps, strategic lawsuits against public participation, as a means of intimidating Brother Jason Hayward of the People's Campaign. In addition, we saw repression in terms of the pressure that was placed upon the Bermuda Broadcasting Company and radio stations that led to the closing down and limiting of talk shows to silence the voice of members of our community that were trying to participate in resistance and be heard. Government efforts to silence resistance also employed both the threat and execution of arrest warrants, targeting protest leaders, the use of chemical weapons in the form of pepper spray, along with militarized, fully armor-clad police, as in the recent, now infamous December 2nd, 2016 pepper spray attack against unarmed protesters. The larger culture of silence that pervades Bermuda in the face of such acts is evident in the almost universal silence in the face of government actions that violated basic human rights. This silence included the Human Rights Commission and other groups around these flagrant abuses of government power to nullify freedom of assembly, free speech in an effort to neutralize existence. One more sentence. These examples highlight the fact that resistance always comes at a price, and those who engage in such action must be committed to the greater cause of freedom and justice, and must be prepared to endure the wrath and consequences that result from challenging systems of white supremacy and power in Bermuda. In conclusion, I trust that these cursory remarks can contribute to advancing our understanding of the need for engaging these issues of race and resistance at a systemic and structural level, so as to break once and for all the vicious cyclical nature of resistance and struggle and put us on a trajectory of freedom and justice. I look forward to uniting together on this journey. And I'll end with a quote from Prophet Monk. There is a poor blind Samson in this land, shorn of his strength and bound in bonds of steel. There is being perpetrated in Bermuda today one of the most brazen-faced pieces of rascality. Forward ever, backward never. Keep the faith.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tweed. We accept the challenge, and we won't talk to the English teachers in the classroom. Did you hear him say he had one sentence?
That was a German sentence.
We will now transition to talking to the representatives from Youth Parliament. So if you will please come to one of the seats that has a microphone. If two of the panelists would please give them a spot, that would be appreciated. Welcome, Robert Thomas of Berkeley Institute, and he's also a dual enrollment student here at Bermuda College, and Mackenzie Cole Tuckett, a Warwick Academy student. I have 3 questions for you today, and the first one I would like for you both to answer. What challenges and observations do you see in Bermuda regarding resistance?
Thank you. I don't think it's on.
Yes.
It is? Okay.
Lean close and
Okay.
speak loudly.
Okay. So during my time at the Future...
No.
No? Okay.
This one's working.
1, 2.
Oh, it is.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. Okay. So during my time at the Future Leaders Program this summer, we heard from many speakers, and one of whom was Miss Lynn Winfield of CURB. Ms. Winfield spoke of the gaps that existed and still exist between blacks and whites. Such gaps are unacceptable, and black people are becoming less willing to accept these differences. Black people should not be disenfranchised simply because they are black. Why should I miss out on an opportunity because of my race, my gender, or any other characteristic that I cannot change and I have no control over?
Thank you. Robert?
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Just to repeat the question, what do I feel is a challenge with resistance in our modern day society? Well, I feel that there's a lot of issues, but they all stem to one specific problem, addressing the youth. And I think that's the fear of addressing the truth of our history, because there is a lot of and specifically in our systems, in our school systems, there's a lot of lack of addressing what has happened to us as a community and what has happened to us as a culture. And it is very important for us to know what has happened to us so that we can move forward. And if you just look to the side of you, one of the quotes say, "Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have." And I just want to twist that and say, ignorance allied with the social movement is the most futile weapon justice can have. So just we as a community and as the future, we need to know where we came from so that way we can move forward. We need to know what has been done in the past, the mistakes that have been made, and the downfalls so that we can rise from those. So I feel that's the main challenge that we face today.
Thank you. Thank you. So your responses appropriately spoke to Bermuda as a whole. My question to you now is, what is your personal experience with resistance, if any?
So while I haven't had any experiences directly, I know that this is an issue facing our world today in Bermuda. I am also aware that it's because of those who fought for justice and equality before us that we are able to be who we are and have the opportunities that we have today. For that, we owe those who fought a debt of gratitude. As young people have an obligation to do our best and take nothing for granted.
Thank you.
Okay. I feel that, like Ms. Kenzie said, I haven't directly experienced any particular issues with resistance. But one thing that I've noticed as an undertone going throughout my life and going throughout the school is that what I wouldn't say is a challenge of experience, but what I haven't experienced. And what I haven't experienced is the knowledge, is the content, is the history, is the background behind what has happened to us as a movement. And what I say is one of the hugest experiences today, coming here, experience the panel, seeing all these different ideas, all these different facts and statistics of what has happened to us. And it's just really eye-opening as to the resistance that we have gone through as Bermudians. And I feel like there's this cloak over this history that has prevented us from moving forward. So I say that my experience today has definitely opened my eyes as to what needs to be done. And I believe it was one of my panelists who says, resist the urge not to be proud of your truth. And I definitely took that to heart. And I would like to tell all of us, resist the urge not to be proud of our truth.
So I would like to dig just a little bit deeper on Robert's answer just now, because you have, both of you and all of us, been exposed to a lot of information today, and in many cases, new knowledge. And so what I would like for you to do, please, is to provide one piece of knowledge that you learned about today that was particularly impactful, and explain why.
Wow, it's hard to pinpoint to one that was really impactful because it was all very impactful. And actually, I'd just like to congratulate all the panelists who have spoken today. You all did an eloquent job. But just to pinpoint something that really surprised me was when Mr. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Ruidesu, he began talking about discrimination against Portuguese. I thought that was really interesting because when we look at the topic of discrimination, the topic of racism, we just think blacks versus whites. We just think slavery. We just think post-emancipation, and all of these sorts of things. But when we actually take a in-depth and knowledge-based look at the topic, we realize that it's much broader than it actually seems. And that was one of the things that really opened my eyes. And it's important that we have sessions like these so our eyes can be open, because now I am encouraged to go myself and research and to go myself and dig into things like this. So I thought that that topic of discrimination at a different standpoint was very impactful.
Ms. Cole-Tuckett, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, a general point that I've seen from our speakers this afternoon is that there's still work to be done and there's still room for improvement. And yes, we have come from a point where there have been many issues, but we are making that step, and it all comes down to making more steps. Having heard all this information, it, like Robert said, it encourages us as the youth and our new future. It really encourages us to do more research on these topics and on our history. And also, like Robert, I would like to thank everyone who contributed, whether you were a speaker, a panelist, or if you brought together this symposium. I would like to thank you personally for opening the youth's eyes to these issues.
Thank you, Ms. Cole-Tuckett, and thank you, Mr. Thomas. I do believe that we have time for a few questions, maybe 2 or 3. Could someone please direct them to any of our panel members?
Sorry?
I heard I have a question, but I don't know who said it. Please. Do we have a microphone? It's coming. It's coming behind you, I think.
What's your first name?
Mackenzie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would just want to, just listening to the panelists, I want to say thank you this afternoon for everything that you shared. But it highlights something for me in regards to resistance against persons living with disabilities. And it's an area that I feel that probably someone could have set up there to speak about, and the effect that racism has had on our community and our people to deny the rights and the access of inclusion for persons living with disabilities on our islands. They are still denied access to services, to restaurants, to buildings, and education, access to education. They're still being discriminated against. And so I feel as though this is a topic that we need to continue to have, and it fits in very nicely with the pursuit of equality and justice. So to the panelists, I mean, we spoke about, where's Linda? Linda spoke about resistance with the, I'm gonna say it wrong, LBGYT community. And I said it wrong still? I missed the letter. I'm sorry. There's no why. Apologies. But
Can we have your question, please?
I just wanted to say, the effect that racism has had on us as a people to be able to want to shelter or hide things because we don't want people to accept us, but racism has really created a fear in us as a people to not come out to say that we need to be accepted in many other areas. And so I just wanted your perspective on even acceptance. We had a conversation up here. We were talking about being
sorry, Ms.
naive
Farbert.
and thinking that we are accepted. And
Can
I just
you
wanted
get
your
question?
perspective on how we as a community can be naive in thinking that we are accepted.
Thank you, Ms. Farbin. Would anyone like to respond? Oh, there you are.
Yeah. Yeah. No, not working.
Can you send the microphone along, please? It's on now.
Okay. No. I might probably don't need a mic, but. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. I think you're absolutely right in that we overlooked persons with disability, and I certainly apologize for that, not recognizing it. We apologize. And I think that is part of how we don't have a lot of conversations around things that make us uncomfortable. And I think that is what you're talking about when you say that we present as if we are accepting and are progressive, when in reality, a lot of this is staying in your place and staying silent and staying under the radar. Right? And until we as a community in our households, amongst our friends, have these necessary conversations, then we will not progress. We will not progress. And that is why really something like this should be complete. We should be filling like 10 rooms, because that's how important this conversation about race is, and the reality of racism in Bermuda, and the reality of the need to resist in Bermuda. We should be filling 10 rooms, but we won't, because we are afraid to have those conversations. And we're absolutely afraid to talk about how we have failed persons with disability by not always including them at the table. So certainly as a unionist and as an activist, I think we owe them an apology, and you an apology.
Thank you. I believe that we have reached our time limit. I would like to thank the members of the panel, and I would also like to thank the audience for your attention.